August 13th, 1945, 2:30 in the afternoon. The Manchurian summer heat bears down on Private Kenji Nakamura as he searches through the abandoned iron mine shaft near Harbin, following orders to locate and eliminate any remaining evidence of Japanese military operations before Soviet forces complete their devastating advance through territory that the Kwantung Army has defended for over a decade. Nakamura expects to find abandoned equipment, scattered documents, or perhaps wounded Japanese soldiers who require assistance during the chaotic retreat that has transformed the most elite army in the Japanese Empire into scattered units fleeing toward uncertain refuge in Korea or Japan itself. Instead, he discovers 3 Korean women huddled in the deepest section of the mine, their faces showing the kind of terror that comes from understanding that their survival depends entirely on the mercy of a Japanese soldier whose military training has taught him to view them as security liabilities requiring immediate elimination rather than human beings deserving protection. The oldest woman, Park Mi-young, perhaps 24 years old despite appearing much older due to malnutrition and systematic abuse, recognizes Nakamura's military uniform and begins speaking in broken Japanese mixed with Korean, her words tumbling together as she desperately attempts to communicate circumstances that she cannot adequately explain in any language that possesses vocabulary for the systematic sexual slavery that has defined her existence for the past 3 years. "Please," Mi-young whispers, her voice barely audible in the echoing darkness of the mine shaft. "We are not soldiers. We are not spies. We were taken from our homes. We have done nothing wrong. Please, do not kill us." Dirju, Nakamura stares at these women and realizes that he has encountered the human reality behind the euphemistic military orders about comfort station personnel, whose elimination has been deemed necessary for operational security during the retreat that will determine whether Japanese forces can maintain organized resistance or dissolve into complete military collapse. His training has prepared him to follow orders without question, to eliminate security threats efficiently, and to prioritize military objectives over personal feelings or individual moral considerations. But nothing in his military education has prepared him to understand how 3 starving, terrified women could represent threats requiring lethal force. Behind him, perhaps 200 meters away, he can hear the voices of his unit commander and fellow soldiers who are conducting their own searches through the industrial complex, following the same orders that have brought Nakamura to this moral crossroads, where institutional loyalty conflicts with basic human recognition of innocence that demands protection rather than elimination. In 15 minutes, Sergeant Ishida will expect Nakamura to report the completion of his assigned sector search. In 30 minutes, the unit will continue their retreat toward the next checkpoint, where they will receive additional orders about evidence elimination that must be completed before Soviet forces can capture materials or personnel that might compromise Japanese military operations or provide intelligence about wartime activities that violate international law. Nakamura faces a choice that will determine not only whether 3 Korean women live or die, but also whether he can maintain his humanity while fulfilling military obligations that have gradually transformed him from farm boy who helped his family grow rice into instrument of systematic violence that serves strategic purposes he no longer understands or supports. In war's final hours, armies destroy evidence. Military doctrine recognizes that retreat operations must include elimination of materials, personnel, and installations that might provide enemy forces with intelligence, resources, or propaganda advantages that could influence post-war negotiations or war crimes prosecutions that might affect military and political leadership. But sometimes, one soldier chooses to preserve humanity. Sometimes, the individual conscience that has survived military indoctrination recognizes moral obligations that transcend institutional loyalty and professional duty when confronted with circumstances that demand choice between systematic evil and personal moral integrity. The Soviet invasion of Manchuria had begun 3 days earlier, with devastating effectiveness that shattered Japanese defensive lines and transformed confident military occupation into desperate evacuation that revealed the complete breakdown of strategic planning and resource allocation that had characterized Japanese administration of occupied territories throughout the Pacific War. Nakamura's unit had been retreating continuously since August 10th, receiving fragmentary orders through radio communications that emphasized destruction of facilities, elimination of evidence, and rapid movement toward evacuation points that might provide transportation to Korean or Japanese territory where reorganization might be possible. The orders regarding comfort station personnel had been delivered through coded communications that used euphemistic language to disguise systematic execution directives. But experienced soldiers understood that evidence elimination meant killing Korean, Chinese, and Filipino women whose testimony about systematic sexual slavery could provide Allied prosecutors with documentation of war crimes that exceeded even the already documented atrocities that had characterized Japanese military operations. Mi Young's presence in the mine shaft reflected her escape from comfort station facility that had been hastily evacuated when Soviet forces approached, but which had followed standard procedures that required elimination of all women who possessed knowledge about systematic sexual slavery operations that Japanese military leadership hoped to conceal from post-war investigation. Her survival thus far had depended on hiding in abandoned industrial facilities while avoiding both Soviet forces who might treat Korean civilians as enemy collaborators and Japanese forces who had received explicit orders to eliminate comfort women as security threats requiring immediate action. The 2 younger women who accompanied Mi Young in the mine shaft were sisters from a village near Seoul who had been recruited through deception about factory work that would provide income for families struggling under Japanese occupation policies that had made normal economic activity nearly impossible for Korean communities. Do you think Nakamura's decision to protect the Korean women reflected genuine humanitarian motivation? Or do you think it reflected psychological rebellion against military authority that used moral justification to mask personal opposition to institutional control and professional obligations that had become psychologically unbearable? The choice that Nakamura made in the mine shaft required him to abandon military training that emphasized instant obedience to superior orders while developing deception strategies that would protect 3 Korean women without compromising his own survival or alerting fellow soldiers to humanitarian activities that violated explicit directives about comfort women elimination. His decision to hide rather than eliminate the women created immediate practical problems about how to report sector completion while maintaining plausible cover story about evidence elimination that would satisfy unit commander without creating suspicion about incomplete mission execution that might trigger investigation or direct supervision. The deception that Nakamura developed involved reporting successful completion of evidence elimination while actually providing the Korean women with food, water, and security information that would help them avoid detection during continued retreat operations that would determine whether Japanese forces could maintain organized resistance or complete dissolution. The 3-day period that followed Nakamura's initial contact with the women required sustained deception that included false reports about mission completion, resource management that diverted personal rations to prisoner support, and psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain normal military behavior while secretly protecting enemy civilians. Mi Young's gratitude for Nakamura's protection created complex emotional dynamics that transcended simple captor-victim relationships to include recognition of shared victimization by military system that had transformed both Korean women and Japanese soldiers into instruments serving strategic objectives that neither group fully understood or personally supported. The conversations that developed between Nakamura and the women during their 3 days of hiding included exchanges about family backgrounds, pre-war occupations, and personal values that revealed common experiences of agricultural community life, family obligation, and cultural traditions that had survived despite systematic attempts to eliminate Korean identity through Japanese assimilation policies. Nakamura's description of his farming background and family rice cultivation created bridges to women's memories of village life before recruitment into comfort station system, demonstrating shared agricultural heritage and community values that existed independently of national boundaries and military classifications. The women's accounts of systematic sexual slavery forced Nakamura to confront the reality of Japanese military policies that had been presented to soldiers as necessary strategic measures, but which actually constituted systematic crimes against civilian populations whose suffering served no legitimate military purpose. The psychological impact of learning about comfort station operations challenged Nakamura's understanding of military honor, national purpose, and individual responsibility for institutional activities that exceeded any reasonable definition of defensive necessity or strategic requirement. The food sharing that characterized the 3-day hiding period included Nakamura providing most of his personal rations to women who had been surviving on minimal nutrition for months, creating survival bonds that connected protector and protected through shared deprivation and mutual dependence. The security measures that Nakamura implemented to prevent discovery included establishing watch schedules, developing communication signals, and creating contingency plans for rapid concealment that would protect the women if other Japanese personnel conducted unexpected searches of the mine facility. The near-discovery incidents that occurred during the hiding period required quick thinking and deceptive explanations that maintained Nakamura's cover story while preventing direct contact between unit members and hidden women whose presence would have triggered immediate execution according to standing orders. The approach of Soviet forces toward the mine area created escalating urgency that forced Nakamura to choose between continuing protection activities that increasingly endangered his own survival and abandoning humanitarian commitment to pursue personal safety through unit loyalty and military discipline. The final day of hiding included Nakamura's development of escape plan that would allow the women to reach Soviet lines where they might receive protection as liberated prisoners rather than elimination as security threats, but which would require him to remain behind to maintain military cover story. The farewell conversation between Nakamura and Mi Young included exchange of family information, promises about post-war contact, and mutual recognition that their 3 days together had created human connection that transcended circumstances of their meeting and would survive regardless of subsequent survival outcomes. The escape operation that Nakamura facilitated involved providing women with directions to Soviet positions, basic survival supplies, and timing information that would allow them to avoid Japanese patrols while reaching enemy lines where liberation might be possible despite continued dangers associated with civilian status in combat zone. The cover story that Nakamura maintained after women's departure included continued false reports about evidence elimination completion while managing psychological stress of uncertain survival outcomes for people whose welfare had become personal moral obligation that transcended military duty. The unit's continued retreat included additional evidence elimination assignments that Nakamura completed according to orders while maintaining internal commitment to humanitarian values that had been strengthened rather than weakened by his experience protecting Korean comfort women from systematic execution. The Soviet capture of Nakamura's unit occurred 2 days after women's escape, creating prisoner status that provided opportunity for him to testify about Japanese military war crimes while hoping that his humanitarian activities might have contributed to survival outcomes for women whose welfare had motivated his moral rebellion against institutional authority. The post-war documentation of comfort women elimination orders appeared in war crimes tribunal proceedings that included testimony from Japanese soldiers who had witnessed or participated in systematic execution directives. But individual humanitarian resistance activities remained largely undocumented due to security concerns and survival considerations. Mi Young's survival of the war included liberation by Soviet forces who provided basic medical care and eventual repatriation to Korea, where she faced social stigma and institutional rejection that reflected community attitudes toward comfort women survivors, despite their status as victims rather than collaborators. The testimony that Mi Young provided to post-war investigators included description of Nakamura's humanitarian protection and moral courage that had preserved her life when military orders demanded her elimination, contributing to historical understanding of individual choice within systematic institutional evil. Nakamura's post-war life included return to agricultural work in Japan, where he maintained silence about wartime humanitarian activities while carrying psychological burden of knowledge about systematic atrocities that had characterized Japanese military operations throughout occupied territories. The eventual contact between Nakamura and Mi Young occurred through veteran reconciliation organizations that facilitated communication between former enemies who sought to process wartime experiences through direct dialogue and mutual recognition of shared humanity that had survived military conflict. The mine shaft where Nakamura had protected Korean comfort women became a memorial site that honored both systematic abuse victims and individual moral courage that had challenged institutional evil through personal sacrifice and humanitarian commitment that transcended national boundaries and military loyalty. The story of Japanese soldier protecting Korean comfort women became part of historical documentation about individual agency within systematic oppression, illustrating possibilities for moral choice that could challenge institutional atrocity while maintaining personal integrity and cultural identity. In the end, the hiding that Nakamura provided for 3 Korean women became evidence that individual conscience could survive military indoctrination to create moments of protection rather than elimination, demonstrating that personal moral choice could interrupt systematic evil when humanitarian obligation demanded resistance to institutional authority. The 3 days that transformed Nakamura from military instrument into humanitarian protector illustrated that moral courage could emerge from recognition of shared victimization by systems that served strategic purposes through individual dehumanization and systematic violence against civilian populations. If stories like this make you think about the individual moral choices that can challenge systematic evil, about the hiding that preserves rather than conceals humanity, about the courage required to protect victims when institutions demand their elimination, then perhaps you understand why some soldiers choose conscience over orders, why some protection becomes sacred rather than treasonous, and why the most important military service sometimes involves saving lives rather than taking them. Preserving evidence of humanity rather than destroying proof of institutional atrocity, and demonstrating that individual compassion can survive even the most systematic training in violence and the most explicit orders to participate in crimes against defenseless civilian populations.